It's important to get to know about St. Mark, the evangelist who first put the gospel in writing. This 12-minute video, which is part 3 of a series, will help you to get familiar with Mark, how he began writing in Rome, how his life suddenly changed after the Great Fire when Nero persecuted Christians and executed Peter, how Peter's remains were preserved, and how fear plagued the lives of so many. I'm Gene Vanderzanden, author of Mark's Passion, an interesting historical novel about St. Mark and his times. Mark began putting the gospel in writing while he was living in Rome, serving as an aide and interpreter for Peter. Peter had been in Rome since 42 AD, although he often traveled to Jerusalem and other important cities in the Mediterranean world when he was needed. Mark spoke Greek, the international language of the time. He could read Greek and write Greek, and was essential to Peter, the Galilean who had become the leader of the worldwide church. Mark heard Peter's stories about Jesus and began to visualize how a written narrative of Christ's public years could be valuable to the Christian community. Again, let's review the scholarly consensus on dates that I covered in part 2 of this series. The majority of New Testament scholars today believe that Mark's Gospel was written first between 64 and 69 AD during the buildup of the Jewish rebellion against Rome. Matthew and Luke followed in the 80s, and John even later in the 90s. I explained how this has become the standard model today among mainline Protestant scholars, Roman Catholic scholars, Orthodox scholars, and even Jewish scholars who work in this field. Mark was a happy man serving at the side of Peter, but his life suddenly changed when the Romans executed his mentor. Nero was a Roman emperor from 54 to 68 AD. Nero was not a great administrative leader, nor a military leader. He was more interested in the arts, music and painting and drama. He was very self-centered. He held on to power, but he devoted himself to the arts. The Great Fire of Rome started during the night of July 18th to the 19th and raged for 6 days. It began in shops in the circus below the Salian and Palatine hills. The night was windy, and the flames spread rapidly, expanding through narrow, twisting streets and closely located apartment blocks. There were no large buildings there, such as temples or open areas to impede the blaze. The population fled first to areas unaffected by the fire, and then to the open fields and rural roads outside the city. Looters and arsonists were reported to have spread the flames by throwing torches or acting in groups to have hindered measures being made to halt the progress of the flames. People said that Nero watched from his palace while singing and playing the lyre. They said he wanted to reclaim the area to build a lavish new palace for himself. And over the next 3 years, the emperor did repossess a vast part of the burned-out area to build a huge new palace and grounds. Of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely devastated by the fire, and only 4 escaped damage. The Christian neighborhood across the Tiber River was untouched. When Nero heard that people were blaming him for initiating the fire, he said, "It wasn't me, it wasn't me. It was the Christians, and I'll punish those heathens." And he began a series of persecutions unparalleled in the young faith. Many were crucified in the Colosseum, while crowds watched with delight. The elderly and the weak were huddled in bunches and then mauled by beasts. Still others were burned alive at the stake. Can you imagine how the Romans took pleasure in this form of entertainment? Historians said that at night, fires consuming the corpses lighted the sky with a red glow. And Peter? Well, the soldiers came for Peter, took him to the Mamertine prison, but on the day of his execution they did not take him to the Colosseum. Instead, they brought him to a circus, a racetrack across the Tiber River, and there they planned to crucify him. Peter said, "I'm not worthy to die like Jesus. Crucify me upside down." And they did. This painting by the Renaissance painter Caravaggio shows the soldiers getting him up into that unwieldy upside-down position. That's how they executed him. He probably didn't suffer as long this way, and there was not as big of a crowd watching him die. And miraculously, they didn't burn his corpse. Some Christians took it and buried it nearby, and St. Peter's Basilica was later constructed at the place where tradition said he was buried. Today, when you go inside the basilica, you see this large four-posted structure, the baldacchino or baldachin. It was intended to mark the spot of his remains below. And if you go down the steps to the level below, which the public is allowed to do, you see this crypt with a coffin that simulates his place of burial. His bones are another flight below. This simulates the resting place of Peter. The public is not allowed to go down to the excavations below without special permission. This is what it looks like down there. Here's a photo of Pope Francis being shown through the excavation shortly after he became Pope. The area was excavated in the 1960s. Yes, in the 1960s, the dirt was removed. They dug back in there, they found the bones, and they found an inscription on the rock. The inscription was deciphered by an expert. It reads, "Petros eini," Peter is here. And the bones are only 3 feet off of the center of the great baldacchino above. And what a wonderful turn of events it was that St. Peter was not executed in the Colosseum, where his remains would have been burned that night. Instead, his body was taken by some Christians to a nearby garden near the place of his execution, and his remains were buried there along with the inscription. This map shows the locations to get you oriented. The red line indicates the wall of the ancient city surrounding the 7 hills and the historic districts. The blue is the Tiber River meandering down from north to south. And if you look up in the left-hand corner, you'll see Vaticano, the hill on which this all took place. Vatican Hill today. That's where they brought St. Peter to execute him, and that's where his remains lie. And down below, in the bend of the river, south of that little island, that's the district where most of the Christians lived. And it's been a traditional neighborhood for Christians throughout the centuries. North of that island, which at that time was a marshy area at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, that's where Mark lived while he was in Rome, in a little house probably not his own. He was of modest means and undoubtedly lived with other people. Today, this spot is marked by the little church of St. Mark. It's not an impressive structure, but try to get to see it when you are in Rome. It will put you in touch with the conditions in which Mark began to write the gospel. Of course, it was very dangerous for Mark to stay in Rome, so he had to leave the city, probably very suddenly. He probably had only the clothes that he could carry and the notes he'd made of Peter's talks about Jesus, and he had to go somewhere else to a place where he could safely finish the gospel. Here's a picture of the Tiber River today. It's not a very big river, just a moderate amount of water that flows to the sea, about 20 miles west on the coast of the Italian peninsula. Fear was growing. The persecutions under Nero set off fear. Can you imagine what all those Christians thought when they saw their friends being crucified and mauled by beasts and burned at the stake? Was this the end times? Is this the end times that Jesus predicted? It must have been a question on every Christian's mind. Well, the emperor clearly was crazy. He wasn't just incompetent, He wasn't just a poor administrator, he was deranged. The army was ruthless. The system was stacked against the people. All over the empire, the system was stacked against the people. We know it was in Jerusalem, but that's the way the empire worked all over the Mediterranean world. The elite were collaborating with Rome. The kings and the wealthy all over collaborated with Rome. And that's how they maintained their positions in a system stacked against the poor. Imperial power was growing. Where is God? They must have said, "Where is God? Where is God?" A terrible, terrible, fearful time to be a Christian. Well, where was Mark in all this? We don't hear from him again from Rome. We don't know where he finished putting the gospel in writing. It could have been most anywhere where he could carry his notes and papers. We don't hear from Mark again from anywhere. What we have is the gospel in its present form. I have my ideas on that, and I put what I felt was the most likely scenario in my novel, Mark's Passion. Mark left us with a vital legacy, the stories of Christ, and we all can be grateful for that. So how can we follow up? It's a good idea to read all that you can about Mark. The more that you know about him, the more meaningful the Gospels will be for you. So watch the other videos in this series. You'll learn a lot more. To find them, go to our channel, Mark's Passion. You'll probably want to read Mark's Passion, my historical novel about the adventures of Mark and the challenging times in which he lived. All of the historical events depicted in the book are factual, and it's an interesting and an exciting way to learn more. And I recommend that you go to my website, markspassion.com, and look at the free articles and information you'll find there. There are illustrations, maps, article, and loads of links to other study sources. So take a look at Mark's Passion. It's the electrifying story of a young man's quest for love and his passion for putting what was known about Jesus in writing. Click on the Amazon.com link below this video and go order my book, Mark's Passion. And thanks for watching.